My name is Cherie Haury-Artz, and I work at the Office of the State Archaeologist. And one of my jobs is to do public presentations about what we know about Native Americans, Indigenous Native Americans, especially focused on Iowa. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you today it's a compilation of research, and a lot of it, the best people to ask are the Native Americans themselves. So I rely on a lot of the work by people like Lance Foster and Jonathan Buffalo and other researchers and things. So I am merely the conduit of information here. But if you go on to the next slide, I want to start out with, this is the wordy slide, but this is the University of Iowa's land acknowledgement. It's only been passed in the last year or so, but it is a recognition of the fact that the University of Iowa property was once the homeland of not just the Iowa and not just the Meskwaki, but the Ojibwa, the Anishinaabe, the Bakoji, which is the Iowa, the Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, Missouri, Omaha, Osage, Oto, Ottawa, Ponca, Potawatomi, the Meskwaki and the Sauk, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, the three affiliated tribes, and the Ho-Chunk. So there are a lot of indigenous people associated with Iowa. The Omaha, the Ponca, the Meskwaki, and the Ho-Chunk continue to have relationships. There are trust lands in Iowa that are associated with them. So they continue to thrive in the state of Iowa. And as an academic institution, the University of Iowa is trying to take steps to recognize the treaties and the dispossession, the history of dispossession of people, and are trying to make a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So looking at the current experience, trying to recruit Native students and Native faculty and staff so that we can continue to build relationships with the Native tribes. And as a result, members of any of these tribes listed in this document can attend the University of Iowa with in-state tuition, even though the Meskwaki are the only ones currently still in residence in Iowa. So there's my soapbox. So these nations who are associated with Iowa have lots of different origins, different relationships. It's very fluid throughout time. People have been living in Iowa for more than 13,000 years. So you can tell, and there weren't borders, and the groups were very fluid. We, as anthropologists, divide people up by language groups, just like in Europe you could talk about the Romance languages and the Germanic languages and the Slavic languages that are all kind of related to one another. We could have the Siouan-speaking languages and the Algonquin-speaking languages and the Caddoan speakers. So these groups are more closely related, their languages are related, and it looks like this is it shows a history of close association. So the Bakoji, the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, Menominee, Miami, Oto, Ho-Chunk, Omaha, Ponca, Kickapoo, Missouri, all speak closely related languages. Coming from the east, we have the Meskwaki, the Sauk, Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Anishinaabe, and Ottawa. This is a whole different language group, and mostly originated in the northeast. The Caddoan speakers are the Pawnee, and they seem to have originated in the south, coming up from the Oklahoma, Kansas area in there. So tracing language connections is one of the ways that anthropologists try and study movements of people and the associations of groups. Go on to the next one. So I'm going to skip the first 13,500 years and jump up here to the late prehistoric time period. I want to emphasize, of course, that everything we talk about in anthropology and archaeology are all ancestral Native Americans. We classify things in groups and assign names to it just to help us keep the data straight. So late prehistoric people are the same as the late archaic people and Paleo-Indian people. Those are just time categories that help us organize things. So we're going to jump up here to the late prehistoric period, which is before Europeans have arrived in Iowa. So let's go on with that. The late 21,000 to 1673. It's characterized by large semi-permanent villages that were based on agriculture. They were farmers. They've been farming for several thousand years. Farming started in Iowa about 3,000 years ago. Now they have large villages. Corn shows up in Iowa about 1,000 years ago, followed closely by beans. And this is when agriculture really takes off big time. So we have large villages focused on corn, bean, and squash, growing all their native plants as well. They built large rectangular earth lodges, most people, and they're hunted with the bow and arrow. When you have agriculture, you have to store your food. You've grown everything you're going to eat for the next year, and you have to dry it and store it. So we find large cache pits associated with the houses in these villages. These are inside a house. We also find them outside of the house. So you have to store things too. Go on to the next one. So we have 4 different cultural groups that we recognize in Iowa. The Great Oasis, the Mill Creek, the Glenwood, and the Oneota. These are classified on the basis of their culture, material culture. So people who have certain pottery types, certain ways that they arrange their villages, certain styles of projectile points and things like that. So we group them together in different groups. Great Oasis and Mill Creek appear to have evolved out of even earlier indigenous groups, what we call the woodland period, who were living in Iowa at the time. The Glenwood people are associated with the Central Plains tradition. They came out of Kansas and Nebraska, slipped across the Missouri River into the Loess Hills, and they have a rather different culture. These people had really tightly packed villages, often with fortifications around them, trenches and walls and things. The Glenwood people, the people of the Glenwood culture, had widely dispersed houses rather than packing tight in a village. They were distributed up along the ridges throughout the Loess Hills. They didn't seem to be terribly worried. They weren't fortified, things like that. But all of these groups were were corn farmers, and bison hunting and things like that. The Oneota appear coming in from the American Bottoms, the area down by St. Louis. So we're going to focus on them because they are the ancestors of all of those Siouan-speaking groups that we were talking about a minute ago. So if you go on to the next slide, this is a distribution of all the Oneota sites that we know of in Iowa. It's probably a little out of date, but it's a pretty good summary. So hit the slide again, and you'll see that these are the earliest sites. So radiocarbon dating shows that these sites right along the Mississippi in southeastern Iowa and along the Des Moines, and this is how we suspect that these people were coming up the Mississippi River from St. Louis down in the American Bottoms. They were traveling by water. They were settling right along the Mississippi, and then they went right straight into the center of what we now call Iowa, following the Des Moines River. One more click there. Some of them went all the way up, and we have a large concentration of Oneota up in northeastern Iowa, but that seems to end by about 1685. One more click, but it continues. Oneota occupations continue into the 1700s. So this is crossing that line into when Europeans are moving into the region as well. Blood Run, I will point out here. This was a very large site. Part of it's in Iowa, part of it's in South Dakota. It was a major hub. Many of the tribes that we've named so far have traditions about coming to the Blood Run area and doing trading and things like that. They're just right about there where the top of the 1700 is where those pipestone quarries are, where they were quarrying red pipestone, and there's a lot of evidence at Blood Run of pipe manufacturing and things like that. So that was probably one of the trade items of this future that made this such an important location. Go on to the next one. So we identify Oneota sites based on their distinctive artifacts that they left behind. So this is classic Oneota pottery, large globular vessels, round bottom, smooth surface, strap handles. They were bow and arrow hunters, so we find small, very basic, triangular points. Hit it again. We find a lot of pipes, not only made out of the red pipestone from the pipestone quarries, but this is grayish, greenish pipestone, comes from central Illinois. They also made ceramic clay pipes. Hit it again. We also find, when you start getting into serious corn agriculture, hey, come on in. We find lots and lots of things for processing all that corn and grain that you're growing. So we find these big grinding stones. Grinding stones go way back in time because people have been collecting wild plants. But when you get into the agricultural communities, you find they're bigger, and there are lots more of them because you've got to grind up that corn and process it. Go on to the next one. And we also find a lot, so go from these dainty, delicate little teeny tiny arrow points to the great big grinding stones and the great big mallets. These are the sledgehammers of the time. Large granitic rocks, usually with a groove tucked in it, for all your pounding, smashing needs. But these are also very common at these sites, and they probably have a lot to do with building these earth lodges and homes that they were living in. Go on to the next one. So the Oneota were the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, the Bakoji, the Missouri, the Maha, the Oto, and the Ponca. So all of these tribes, they have very similar languages, and they were all probably descendants of this Oneota culture that we were talking about. In fact, Ho-Chunk, in their language, the word is Ho-Chunk-Gura, which means the speakers of the mother speech. And they established themselves as probably having most closely related to the Oneota language. And then as these other groups broke off, just like our English isn't the same as the English they speak in England or Australia, as groups split apart, the languages start to change. I don't think people in France could really even understand Cajun French or French Canadian. So languages change as groups separate apart, but you can still see that they're related. So all of these groups are descended from those Oneota people that we were seeing across the state of Iowa. So this brings us into the period of contact with the Europeans and Euro-Americans. So 1673 is when Marquette and Joliet paddled down the Mississippi River, and they were the first Europeans that we know of to make contact with Native Americans living in the Midwest. It's hard to just keep saying Iowa because there was no Iowa at the time. But they paddled down the Mississippi River and they wrote things down. So we know there may have been a few fur traders or something slipping over, but they were probably illiterate and we'll never know about it. But these guys kept journals and diaries and letters and things like that. So we start to get a written record of a little bit more about what these people were doing here. Go on to the next one. There they are. Every picture I've ever seen, Father Marquette is standing up in the canoe. So these guys are probably looking up there going, not a good strategy standing up in a canoe coming down the Mississippi River. But these are the first known Europeans to visit. Father Marquette was there to convert people religiously, and Joliet was a businessman. He was a trader, so he was looking for trading opportunities. Go on to the next one. So it's so hard to pin things down. This is around 1825. All of the boundaries are very fluid. People moved around. They are in contact with each other. This is a locations of major tribes in the 19th century in Iowa. So we see the Iowa. They were everywhere. We put them in the middle. The Meskwaki and the Sauk were fairly late arrivals coming into Iowa, moving down from Minnesota and Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk are still in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they were also coming down into northeast Iowa. Then we have a large number of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, were plains people who did lots of bison hunting out on the plains, but they also passed back and forth through Iowa, especially western Iowa. The Omaha, Pawnee, Oto, Missouri. Remember, these and the Ho-Chunk, these are all closely related people, so they've spread out and changed slightly. We also know that there were other groups here, including the Kaskaskia, Menominee, Ojibwa, or Anishinaabe, Ottawa, Potawatomi. They primarily were east of the Mississippi, but that wasn't a barrier for people, so they were back and forth in here too. Go on to the next slide. So for our purposes today, I can't cover everybody. So we're going to zoom in on the Bakoji, the Meskwaki, and the Sauk for a little bit more information, a little more detail about the associations with these people. So let's go on. All of these people, as I say, they were corn farmers. They lived in large villages, and following their traditions. And this is from the Meskwaki website, and it's a really nice illustration of what we call a season around. So they were intimate with their environment. They knew every detail of the plants and animals, what was good for you, what was bad for you, when things were ripe, where to find the right kind of rocks and stones to make tools with, and things like that. So they moved locations, but it wasn't, I always hear people talking about people wandering the landscape. They weren't wandering, they knew exactly where they were going and what they needed to do. So one of the things they did move to take advantage of resources as they became available. So in the winter, they would break up into small groups and move down the river valleys and settle in the woodlands where you needed, it was winter, you needed lots of firewood to keep warm. You didn't want to have 300 people living in one location. You'd use up too much firewood too fast, and you'd have to keep going farther and farther as the winter got colder and colder. So in January, who wants to go a mile for looking for wood? So these were small groups scattered up and down the valley, riding from the settlement in Tama County, the Meskwaki settlement, to Iowa City with Jonathan Buffalo, and he can say, oh, that was where so-and-so used to have their winter camp, and over there was where so-and-so was. So these traditions are still conscious in their knowledge. And then in the spring, the very early spring, they would move to a maple sugar camp. And this was where they would tap the trees as the trees starts to rise, the sap rises. These are the times that the Iowa referred to as the starving months. You've been through the winter, your stores, you've been eating, you've eaten up most of the food you had stored for the winter, and it's not quite, things aren't quite greening up yet to get a lot of resources, natural resources. So the berries aren't ripe and the leaves are just starting to show up in the trees. So this was a difficult time for people. And these maple sugar camps, it was a treat to have the maple sugar. They didn't boil it to syrup, they boiled it all the way to sugar because that's much easier to store. So this is where they would get any and all of their supplies of sugar. And then in the winter they also did some trapping and hunting, and then they would come to the summer village. They would all come together from their various sugaring locations into a big village. And they would build different types of houses. This was a big social group. This is where the gardens were. This is where the farming was done. And all three of the groups that we're talking about now, the Iowa, the Meskwaki, and the Sauk, followed a similar kind of ground. see, maybe you can't see the writing's kind of small, but the Meskwaki names for the different months and seasons are based on what you were doing. So there's trapping time, and there's corn planting time, and autumn, the fall hunt, things like that. So that's how they were divided up their year. Go ahead. This is a picture. This is a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. It's a children's book called A Year with the Sauk and the Meskwaki. It's extremely accurate. Tom Wilkinson did the illustrations for it, and they're beautiful. He actually, if you visit the Meskwaki Culture History Museum, there's great big versions of his paintings in there. But this shows the people just arriving at their summer village. They're coming in from all their various winter camps and maple sugar camps. They're reconstructing the old houses, so they've had a rough winter, and they're putting new bark coverings on it, rolling out woven mats. This one is a new house completely being built, but these were large houses where several families lived. It was very different from the small wickiups. Go on to the next one. This is the little wickiup. This is where you went in wintertime. Wintertime was the storytelling time. This was when the kids went to school. This is where you guys would sit in here, and you could see this woman is telling stories, and the kids are all listening. This is where you learn your history. This is where you learn your family traditions. You learn about Uncle so-and-so and Grandpa, and you learn how to survive, what are good foods, how to cook, how to make your tools, and things like that. So these are fairly small homes. They're cozy. You got to heat it, keep it warm, and the summer houses were much larger and occupied by several families. Go on to the next one. So let's take a look at the Bakoji, or the Iowa Nation. We recognize that they are descendants of the Oneota. They're closely related to many of the other people with the same language group. And their traditions are often closely associated with it. Here is a portrait of some Iowa leaders painted by Charles Bird King to give you an idea of some of the clothing they wear. Anytime these people sat for a portrait to be painted, they put on their best clothes, just like you would if you were going out to pay money for a fancy portrait. You would put on your best. So much of the items that they are wearing are symbolic. It will tell somebody who's knowledgeable about the culture what your rank is, how skilled a hunter you were, what societies you were associated with, things like, instead of somebody might wear a mason's pin or a Phi Beta Kappa key or something like that. The things that these people are wearing in these portraits are symbolic of things like that. Go on to the next one. These are some more 19th century Iowa Indians. And I want to focus in on No Heart of Fear. I'm not even going to try and say his name in Bakoji language. But a lot of these names are familiar to you. White Cloud or Mahaska. White Clouds and Mahaskas all over the state of Iowa. There are actually two people by this name, father and son, called Mahaska 1 and Mahaska 2 to help keep it straight. Reigning, and these people were all well-known leaders. But let's zoom in on No Heart of Fear. In 1837, a delegation of the Iowa traveled to Washington, D.C. This is a time when Native groups are being pushed west across the Mississippi River. There's getting to be some competition. People are being moved around and squeezed into smaller and smaller groups at the behest of the United States government, who totally didn't understand how these culture groups worked and how the societies worked. So they decided they would try and work with the way the government wanted to work, and they took their delegation, they traveled to Washington, D.C., and in the part of the negotiations they went on, what they were trying to establish was the fact that they had a long history in the area. No Heart, we don't actually know if No Heart drew the map or somebody else in the delegation was. He is the recognized leader of the delegation, so it's often referred to as the No-Hart map, or the 1837 Iowa map. But it reflects, they drew this from memory by hand. And you'll get more impressed as we go on. So this is all based on knowledge which is orally transmitted. So father to son, mother to daughter, through time. Go on to the next one. You can recognize all of the rivers on this site. You can find the Iowa River, the Des Moines, we've got the Mississippi and Missouri, and they include villages, trails between the villages. You can see it's starting to spread. This is the Wisconsin River, this is the Rock River, this is Wisconsin, this is Illinois, the Platte, we're talking Nebraska now. Go on to the next one. Map covers 300,000 square miles, drawn from memory. If we look at, we know where the Platte enters the Missouri River, that's where Omaha is, where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together at St. Louis, Madison on the Wisconsin River. And if we put this on a modern map, you can see, could you draw that much? Yeah, from memory? It's pretty intense. So this is based on research by Mary Whalen, and a lot of this is also done by Bill Green, who was state archaeologist a while ago. Let's go on to the next one. So, reflecting Iowa traditions, this map not only shows things frozen in time, but it shows the spacing, shows political and social relationships between those different villages, and it shows movement through time as well. Look at the trails are all the way up, and this is Lake Michigan up here, all the way out into Nebraska. So if we geo-reference this onto a modern map, we realize exactly how much territory these people could keep in their heads. But it's a really interesting story, because as he drew the map, he was telling the story of their history. So they weren't occupying all this area all at the same time, but they came from here and they went to here and things like that. So it's a very interesting historical document, not only for that time period, but the story of the Iowa over time. Go on to the next slide. As you can see also, the rivers were the highways. When you look at that map, that's how they were moving along. So this is Dugout Canoe. This is at the Meskwaki Culture Center and Museum. It was found eroding out of the bank of the Iowa River, the Des Moines River, sorry, I lied. But this is a kind of boat that people were using to travel in. Go on to the next one. So Iowa villages, they were gradually squeezed out of the state. So this just shows some of the time period. Prior to 1630, they were way up into Wisconsin as well, but as they gradually lost territory, on Iowaville down in Van Buren County was the last big village that they had before they were actually forcibly removed from the state. Go on to the next one. This is Iowaville down there on the Des Moines River. Next. Just to give you a relationship, I'm going to talk a little bit about the last big village of Iowa. Go ahead. There it is. Cindy Peterson in 2012 led an archaeological research project here. It was all done by volunteers on a tiny little budget, but we found some cool stuff. Go ahead. First thing we did was look at private collections. People have been walking across this site picking up artifacts for practically since the Iowa left. Gun flints, brass, tinklers and beads and things, pieces of pipes, lots and lots and lots of beads, shell beads and glass beads. This is within the trade period. Go on. Brass kettles and pots and things like that. Some of the pots actually still have preserved seeds in them, from squash seeds from the garden. Also some trade materials, trade rings. Next one, more things. Gun parts. These are pieces of flintlock rifles. These are Northwest trade gun rifles. They had a serpent on the side of it, so they're very distinctive. Lead shot. And lots of things made out of brass. If you had a kettle and it fell apart, they used the brass and made other things out of it. Go on to the next one. Okay, now, make your eyes go all blurry. This is a magnetometer survey. A magnetometer reflects magnetic reflections of the site. Every one of these black and white spots is something reflecting back the magnetics. Can you see a circle here? Go ahead and hit the thing and I'll outline it. There you go. It's one of those Rorschach things where you let your eyes go blurry and after a while you can kind of see it. Hit it again. There's another circle. These attracted the archaeologist's attention. A lot of this stuff, this field, has been in agriculture. So these are nails and staples and bits of metal and things like that. But these circles caught our attention. So we placed some test units across the units. Go ahead and click it, I think. This is how big the circles are. The big circle is almost the size of a football field, and there's the little circle. What are they? Go ahead and do the next one. And next one. These might represent earthworks. Other archaeological sites elsewhere in Iowa, also associated with Oneota culture, have earthworks. These things have been piled up, dirt piled up to create these things. And village occupation inside and outside. So these enclosures have been found up in Alameda County, where they haven't been plowed down like they have in Dugout Canoe. It might be what those big circles represent. Go on to the next one. When we tested inside those, we found all kinds of goodies. I don't know if you can see very well. There's a dark colored mound here. Go ahead and click it and it'll outline it. And then you can see clearly there's all kinds of stuff sticking out. There's bones, there's pots, there's debris. This is an ash lens here. So this is a garbage dump. People were cleaning out the house, cleaning the fireplace, and dumping stuff and making this big pile. On to the next one. So we found guns in there, we found silver, we found all kinds of cool stuff in those pits. Iowa continues to thrive today. They have a reservation in overlaps in White Cloud, Kansas, but it's Iowa and Nebraska both. There's another group that moved in the late 19th century. They moved to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, and they call themselves the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma. So we've got the Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska and the Iowa and Oklahoma. But they have a museum here. This is Lance Foster's Cultural History Museum. They are trying to retain their language, so traveling you will see things like stop sign in English and in Bakoji. Go ahead. A few famous Iowa that you might know about. Mahaska I and his son, Mahaska II. They were important leaders during the treaty period. Marie Dorian, you've heard of Sacagawea. Marie Dorian led explorers as well from the Pacific Fur Country, and she took them all the way to the Pacific Ocean as well. You don't hear about her. Lance Foster, alive and well. He's an Iowa historian, he's an author, he's an artist. Lance does everything, and some of his artwork, this lovely picture, hangs in World Food Prize Hall of Laureates. So just to let you know that Iowa are still among us. Go ahead to the next one. Let's take a quick look at the Sauk and the Meskwaki. If you visit the settlement in Tama County, it's called the Sac and Fox of the Mississippi. There's no Fox tribe, and the Sac and Fox are two different nations. This was one of those never got untangled when the Europeans came. The Meskwaki have a clan called the Fox, who evidently encountered the French somewhere along the way, and they said, "We're the Fox." Like I would say, "My name is Haury." And they wrote it down, and they became the Fox forever, the Menards, and they can't seem to shake it. But they prefer being called the Meskwaki. They're both Algonquin speakers. They trace their origins to the northeast. They're closely related, in the 17th and 18th century, they were in Michigan, Wisconsin area. Go on to the next slide. The Meskwaki means the Red Earth people. They trace their origins to Quebec, way back there. This is where they received the name Red Earth people. Somebody says, "But the Earth isn't red here." That's because the Earth was red up in Quebec. Go ahead. This is a work Jonathan Buffalo, the Meskwaki tribal historian, has done, following not only the oral traditions, but then going back and looking for historic documentation or they went through New York, so they encountered the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and they have stories about their interactions with the Meskwaki. So through time, the Meskwaki originated here, the Sauk originated here. Both groups moved gradually south and east and west, ended up in Michigan and Wisconsin, where they were really involved in the fur trade. Go on to the next one. And until about 1630, they were major influences in the French fur trade. The French didn't like that very much. So the Meskwaki were allied with the English and the Americans, and the Chippewa, Ottawa, Neutrals were allied with the French, and there was a pretty serious business competition going on. Go on to the next one. So they had a grand village. We call it the Bell site. They call it the Grand Village near Oshkosh in Wisconsin. This was a large village. That region probably had about 12,000 people. There were probably 3,000 people living in this village. But it became, they were a political and military and economic power, and of course that didn't make the French and their Native American allies happy. So they went to war. It's estimated the French and their allies laid siege to the Grand Village. They burned it twice. This is the first documented recent of hand grenades actually being launched by the French into the Grand Village of the Meskwaki. It's estimated that only about 300 people survived and made it out of there. They took shelter with their allies, the Sauk, and both groups moved out of Wisconsin and down the Mississippi River. Go on to the next one. So we find the Sauk generally on the east side of the river and the Meskwaki on the west side. As they lived in Iowa, they took up lead mining. Galena is associated with, it's the ore for lead. The mines of Spain is where the Meskwaki worked the mines, working with Colonel Davenport, Iowa fame. They used the lead themselves, made it into face paint, not a good plan, but they didn't know that at the time. It was traded, they could make it into small artifacts. For them it was just a shiny thing, but as the historic period advanced, pewter has lead in it, and of course lead shot was important too. On to the next one. In 1846, the Meskwaki were also dispossessed of their lands and moved to Kansas on the Meridocene. Jonathan says all that movement they've done has always been in the woodlands. And when they moved them to Kansas, he said if we had stayed there, we would have ceased to be Meskwaki. They were that closely related to their woodland home. So these are some historic pictures from the Historical Society of Meskwaki, and their wiki-ups with the woven mats covering them from the 1800s. But the some Meskwaki didn't get removed. They hid out, especially along the Iowa River. And the Meskwaki were so unhappy in Kansas that they pooled their money. And in 1856, they petitioned the state. Iowa had just become a state. It was a baby state, and they petitioned the state to come be allowed to buy land in Iowa. This is when all those wars are going on out west, massacres back and forth, and to their everlasting credit, the state of Iowa said, okay. And the Meskwaki purchased their land. Go to the next one. They have a deed for their first 300 acres. They purchased in 1857 on the Iowa River, and they were able to move back. Go ahead to this one. And they pooled their resources. They now have more than 8,000 acres. They continue to expand. They have a Red Earth Gardens, which they runs like a CSA, but they grow a lot of food. They have a culture history center. They have their own schools. They have their own legal system, their own police force. It's a wonderful place to visit. If you ever want to go up there, I recommend the Culture History Museum. Go on to the next one. You've all heard of the Navajo code talkers. There were also the Meskwaki code talkers. A lot of people are unaware of this, and it was a long time before that they were actually recognized by the government. In 2008, the Meskwaki code talkers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medals for their role in making uncrackable codes. They were working in the Pacific, whereas the Navajo code talkers were working in the European theater. Unfortunately, they were all dead by the time they got their Congressional Gold Medals, but they did finally get recognized. So this is, an important contribution that we need to recognize from the Meskwaki as well. Go ahead. The Alsakowik, or the Sauk, the people of the outlet, they also trace their origins up near Montreal. Along the Mississippi River, we find the Sauk villages over by the Rock River and Rock Island, whereas the Meskwaki were more commonly on the western side of the river. They followed the same kind of seasonal subsistence strategy, and this is something the European settlers didn't recognize. So at one point when everybody was out for the winter, Europeans moved into the big Sauk village, the Saukanack village, thinking, well, they abandoned it. And when they got back, Black Hawk was one of the leaders there who were not happy. Go on to the next slide. So this shows here where the Saukanack village was, near Rock Island, Fort Madison, to give you a little orientation of where we are. Fort Crawford up there, by northeastern Iowa. The next one, famous Sauk, Black Hawk. He was not a chief. Oftentimes people would call him, he was a chief, but he was a war leader. And their government split war leaders and peace leaders. He led the rebellion as a result of the people burning his village while they were out on their winter settlements. Keokuk was a peace leader. So Black Hawk led a rebellion. Keokuk tried very hard to appease the powers that be, negotiating with the U.S. government and things like that, trying to cooperate. Black Hawk was eventually, after he led his rebellion that was called the Black Hawk Wars, there were really only 3 or 4 big battles, he was defeated in the Battle of Bat Axe. He was taken prisoner and taken on tour back east. And I think the point was, and he got it when they got back east, there are millions of them, there's no way you're going to be able to fight it off. So the Sauk, again, signed treaties and moved out. I want to point out at least one famous Sauk leader was Jim Thorpe, who was a multi-sport athlete and winner of 2 Olympic gold medals in track and field. The Sauk still alive and well, thriving today as well. Go on to the next one. A whirlwind tour, and that's just 3 of the groups of those many. Yeah.
I actually have a question about one of the other groups.
Okay, sure.
The Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago, obviously we have a county in north central Iowa named after them, but did they spend much time in that area?
In northeastern Iowa is where they're associated.
Yeah, Winnebago County is in central, north central Iowa.
Yeah.
It's the county I'm from, and that's why I'm confused about it, because everything I read about the Winnebago, the Ho-Chunk in Iowa, focuses on northeast.
Yeah, the names that got assigned to things don't necessarily, so I'm still wondering how Pocahontas got out of western Iowa.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes people just like the name.
Yeah,
And the Ho-Chunk, mostly prefer the name Ho-Chunk.
Mhm.
However, there is one band in Wisconsin which go by Winnebago. So both names are appropriate. The coolest thing that I know from in their language, the Ho-Chunk have a word that means the time when the ice came down and stopped the river. I'm thinking, that's the Ice Age. They were here. And what they did was they lived in that driftless area in southern Wisconsin and that northeast corner of Iowa. They moved into it as a refugium during the last surge of the glaciations. And they and a lot of animals also took shelter in there too. But that's so cool. And the whole oral tradition